Welcome to the August episode of Loadsmart's First Look, a monthly series that dives into the domestic freight markets and technologies that change the supply chain. Today we have a very special guest, Mark Montague. Mark is what I consider one of the original freight market analysts and someone whose work many of us have been following closely throughout our logistics careers. Mark, thank you so much for joining.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So really just diving right in, it's been an absolutely fascinating year to analyze and study the freight markets. I'm curious to hear what you're seeing and trends and data points that you're looking at.
Yeah, well, when you think about supply chain disruption or changes, 2017 comes to mind, which, culminated in the ELD mandate and then elevated rates throughout 2018. And there was quite a run-up in rates in that. And recently I pulled the data to look and see, well, how does this compare? And this is actually a much sharper change in the freight marketplace. For one thing, we start from the lowest spot that I've seen really in the last, probably this century, as far as freight rates. And now we've climbed to some rates that are in some cases comparable to those 2018 rate levels.
Now, 2017, 2018 was really probably kickstarted, sure, ELDs, but the impact of the two hurricanes really set off and disrupted the supply chain. This is a little bit different, right? Where you have the COVID-19, the pandemic. There's quite a bit more uncertainty and more volatility of the ups and downs. What are some changes you think that might be contributing to what we saw back in 17, 18 versus what we see right now?
Well, of course, we had the economy totally shut down for about 6 weeks, really for most of April. March ended up strong because of all the rush to go to the grocery store and get grocery supplies, even as food service was shutting down. And then you had other industries, automakers, a lot of manufacturing shut down for the month of April and really the first part of May. And that was really the nadir. The low point was mid to late May, when a lot of stuff had ground to a halt, and then we started to see some freight start to come back. Produce season kicked in May. So for refrigerated freight, April was really the low point, but flatbed and van really hit their lowest rates in the month of May. And I actually captured a rate view file from that month, rate view being the DAT product that tracks freight rates. And I took that 30-day sample versus a 30-day sample from today. It was an amazing result. Rates are up 47% for the line haul portion of the van rate in really 2.5 months time frame. One of the things that I also looked at is, well, what happened with volume? And the volumes are up 15.5%. So it's a real increase. As far as what's driving it, that has been a big question on a lot of analysts' minds. I get to talk to some analysts on a fairly regular basis, and partly is the spot market benefits whenever there's disruption. And by disruption, I mean a change in buying patterns. Consumers are buying a totally different market basket of goods than they were 1 year ago. That tends to hurt contract volume somewhat, although contracts also benefit from the volatility. It just takes longer for them to adjust than does the spot market. So that gets probably into another question that you have.
Yeah, it's a perfect segue, because there's a lot of questions right now about what's going to happen, what's happening right now, but with the inflection point in contracted rates. We've seen the previous 18 months, contracted rates have been relatively depressed and almost getting worse. And now you're seeing this sharp uptick in contract rates that I'm curious to see what you are observing with contracted rates, right? And even looking forward, what does this mean over the next 12 months for the next contracted RFP cycle?
Yeah, there's really three stories. Van is really experienced the biggest spike in change, and I think that's just because there's so many more commodities in the van area. Certainly, food and grocery is both dry and refrigerated, but as far as personal protective equipment, things of that nature, that's pretty much in the van. Hand sanitizer and stuff, which are become some very popular items. Also, beverages, water, and all those kinds of things are van freight. As far as what's happened on the contract side with van, we started to see contract van rates rise. The first indicator was in July. Normally there's a slump in freight post July 4th. Did not happen at all this year, and the contract rates are up again in August after a slight rise in July. Not a whole lot. The one segment that was really lagging was flatbed, and flatbed rates on the contract side never really took much of a dip, but they are starting to rise a little bit now in August. The oil and gas industry, which drives a lot of flatbed business, in the state of Texas and anywhere where there's oil production, that is still extremely depressed. I think about 3/4 of the country wells are still closed, according to the Baker Hughes report. We're not seeing a lot of bleed off there, but throughout April, May, and June, we were losing a lot of well productions, and those require a lot of chemicals and drilling support to keep them going. So that is a big part of freight that's missing in the flatbed arena. However, it looks like construction in other parts of the country, in the Southeast in particular, has been pretty strong really since May, and now we're starting to see some contract rate increases on the flatbed side. Interestingly enough, though, contract rates in the reefer segment are down in August. Now that is really just a juxtaposition versus what's happened in the spot market, where the reefer rates were the first to rise in the spot market starting in May. Of course, that was driven by strong produce out of California. And then as we've seen some recovery in other parts of the economy, the food service supply chain was totally emptied. And now we had to kind of replenish that food service supply chain for the limited availability of restaurants and for takeout. And that's helped to get reefer really going at a strong rate. But according to one carrier I talked to, a lot of those rates were renegotiated, saying that May, June period, say June 1st. And the shippers were pretty brutal on the carriers during that time period. Now you've seen a boomerang. So, yeah, you'll see recovery in contract rates throughout the fall. The big question, though, is how much does the spot market remain a driver?
Going back to 2017, 2018, is there anything we can learn from of how contracted rates followed the disruption in the marketplace? Considering there is some comparison between now and what we saw back then.
Yeah, but one thing that I did is I looked at the correlations between spot market rate changes and contract rate changes. And it can be anywhere from 2 to 6 months out. A lot of contracts are 1-year contracts. Some contracts now, though, are evergreen, or, hey, we're going to talk quarterly. And, the carriers kind of like that when things are going up to talk quarterly. And I imagine the shippers were enjoying it as rates were really being deflated in the early part of the year. But I really think, strong believer in ongoing dialogue. It's hard to hold contract rates solid for a year, because either things are going up and the carrier feels they're shortchanged, or things are going down and the shipper feels they're paying too much. And particularly with more information out in the marketplace, so to benchmark rates and what's out there, it doesn't take much change in behavior of carriers to produce a shortage and we'll certainly see that in load tenders, and some of the other data source providers that are out there. There's a lot more tightness in the marketplace, and that is also a driver of contract rates. The rates don't necessarily change, but the low-cost carriers tend to disappear because they took those cheap rates that they negotiated, say, maybe in April and May, and now they're chasing a few more spot opportunities. So,
absolutely, I think it starts with the carriers first that will start to renegotiate. We've definitely seen that. We've seen the national carriers taking some of those commitments, putting that capacity into the spot market. And I think 3PLs they follow that. I think the carriers begin there, the 3PLs follow. So on the 3PL side, the contract has been difficult or challenging as margins are compressed. But it seems like the trend is following it, where as this is more of a prolonged situation, that the 3PLs follow suit and actually renegotiate some of those contracts. That going into 2021, it could be an interesting situation of how carriers and 3PLs alike approach contracted pricing.
Yeah, there's one other point I'd like to bring up, and that's, the contracts could start moving as much as 2 months after spot market. And, here we see June is when it really became apparent the spot market was coming back strong. In August, already seeing it in a van and a little bit in flatbed. The other thing is I used to track rail intermodal, and rail intermodal, we track the 53-foot domestic product, which is really closely tied to the van spot market. And it used to be about a 2-month lag for rail pricing. And then I saw it shorten up that the correlation was strongest with a 1-month lag. So the rails obviously track the van spot market and change their pricing accordingly. And I see off the West Coast, they're actually putting in some $500 surcharges on those intermodal moves, which will just drive more truck freight.
Yeah,
you talk about market impacts. It's a west-east story, with California really leading the parade. Was that going to be one of your next topics?
It absolutely was. You read my mind. So we're also at the point of the year that we really need to start thinking about the retail season, the lead up until the holidays, that also is typically led with west to east. Imports through the West Coast seem to continue to be strong, which to most of us would paint a picture that this will continue off the West Coast as we get closer into this retail season. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I really think demand was tamped down to essentials in April and May, so that all that kind of demand. I mean, a lot of people have maintained their standard of living through the pandemic, thanks to government stimulus or essential jobs, and we've seen maybe the numbers come down from 15% to 10% unemployment. Certainly, the strength of the fall season depends a little bit on what final stimulus package is brought forward. But I do think that there's tremendous momentum. When I looked at a lane-by-lane basis, the thing that shouted out was that overwhelmingly, anything coming out of LA has really jumped in the forefront as far as price changes in volumes. I'll just have a couple of example lanes. The number one lane for dollars was Los Angeles to Dallas. And on that particular lane, rates jumped from a line haul of $1.22 to $2.64. So that's 116.4% rate increase. Well, $1.22 is not sustainable. That lane typically runs somewhere around $1.75 to $2. But $2.64, that is like your peak. Going back to the fall of 2017, that's like ELD mandate type number. Another lane that really jumped up was LA to Chicago. Now that was horribly depressed. I was tracking that lane. I remember a lot of times, when it's not too strong, it'll drop down to $1.40, jump up to $1.60. That lane fell all the way down to $1.01 for line haul in May, and now it's up to $2.11. So there's another lane that's up 108, 109%. You see some more mild things out of other parts of the country, like Dallas to Denver, from $1.54 to $2.36. That's a 54% increase. Atlanta to Allentown went from $1.46 to $2.46, 68% increase. Overall, though, rates are up 47%. And you notice I'm talking about places like Atlanta, Dallas, LA. If you look at the upper quadrant of the U.S., Pacific Northwest or Rocky Mountains, you really don't see that dramatic a shift. And if you look at the tools the DAT puts out for load demand, that's the pale or the blue area of the map where we really haven't seen strong market conditions. Another area that's kind of softened up since May is Florida, particularly out of Miami, and that's often a case of imbalance. All of a sudden, there's a lot more freight coming inbound from places like Atlanta and other parts of the country, and it just doesn't generate enough freight to keep the rates in balance coming back out of Florida.
Something, another market or region to look at is Texas. And the reason I bring that up is northbound Mexico has been severely out of balance, way beyond previous years. And it goes into what you illustrated earlier, where you had the shutdown in April. But what Mexico provides, supplies to the U.S., is you think about autos in a big way. Now, autos have come back fully online and actually are producing more to try to catch up. They produce appliances and essentially the consumer goods, right, that are booming right now. So looking at northbound for Mexico, there is an enormous amount of demand, almost 3x the typical volumes that we've seen the last 2 years, which also gives some credence to the momentum that this really most likely will continue throughout the rest of the year if you combine the imports from the West Coast as well as what's being pushed through the southern border as well.
Yeah, Chris, we have the new trade deal with Mexico, and you're seeing, the recovery of the auto supply chain. There's also a shift, I think, for some of the goods that have been sourced from China and Asia to Mexico manufacturing. Interesting enough, and I don't often see these lanes like in the top 100, but I noticed some lanes out of El Paso going up into the Midwest and other parts of the country that made that list. The other thing that happens is you have stuff going from Laredo into Dallas area warehousing and then reshipping from Dallas, Fort Worth into the rest of the country. So Dallas definitely showed up. Texas in general showed up as the second biggest driver after California. But I was surprised to see some stuff out of El Paso. Not necessarily from Laredo, the rest of the U.S., as I indicated. I think a lot of that gets short-hauled into Dallas or other distribution centers, perhaps in Houston. And then from there, it gets transshipped into the rest of the U.S.
As we wrap this up, the final question I have for you, who's your World Series pick this year?
I'm a Chicago Cubs fan, and they're off to one of the strongest starts. They're 11-3. Their starting pitching is solid. Plus, they got Quintana is coming back from a thumb injury. He injured his thumb in a dishwashing accident. So, for all you husbands out there, get a dishwasher.
It's a loaded question. I'm also a Cubbies fan, so I'm with you there, Mark. This has been awesome. Great discussion. Love hearing your insights, and thanks so much for coming on. I'd love to do this again.
Yeah, it's really fun to do this. I'm sitting here. I've done all the household typical stuff that you can do, And it's really time to, especially this is a great time to look at the freight marketplace and to analyze what's going on, because it's really a lesson for us how fast things can change, especially when you've got dynamic information tools that can help speed up decision making.